So let's get on back to Theodore Roosevelt here. Pull this back up and pick up where we left off with Roosevelt and his gunboat diplomacy or big stick diplomacy. Either term is okay. I kind of prefer gunboat diplomacy myself. Big stick diplomacy can have a little bit of a different kind of connotation to it, and everybody giggles when you say it. So we go with gunboat diplomacy most of the time.
I like it.
Yeah, I'm sure. So the biggest problem Theodore Roosevelt had was this idea of moving those gunboats from one ocean to the other in the event of war. We were separated by this vast continent. And if you had to sail all the way around Tierra del Fuego down in South America, it would take, at the minimum, weeks, really months, to get all the way through. And if you had to do it in the wintertime, you just couldn't do it because it was frozen. So the solution was to try and create a canal through Central America. This was not a new idea. People had been trying to build a canal for decades by this point, and they had been searching for a natural one for a century. The most obvious places are either Nicaragua or Colombia. Now, I'm using the word Colombia because there was no nation called Panama yet, but it's where Panama is today, okay? Nicaragua or Colombia. And France had been trying to build a canal here since way back in 1881. They'd been ineffective at it. The tools weren't right. The disease was something difficult. You know, they were dredging largely with mules and dynamite to try and get this done. And it's a tough thing to do. Plus, the swamps they were connecting, one of the reasons why these spots were good was not just that it was narrow, but that there was a series of lowlands, a series of either swamps or lakes that you could connect. So you didn't have to dig the whole way. That was an advantage. But it also meant that it was mosquito area. And malaria was rampant in here. And while the natives weren't dying from it, because they had grown up around it, they had an immunity to a lot of that, the Europeans were. And the French were dying en masse of it, okay? So there's our big issue. Theodore Roosevelt decides we have to have this canal. So he starts negotiating, and the Colombian spot, again, that's where Panama is today, is deemed to be the most economical. It's not the shortest, but it's the most economical. You don't have to go through as many mountains. It's got more lakes. It just makes more sense to go through there. So he enters into negotiations. He sends down an ambassador to negotiate with the Colombian Senate, the Colombian government. And they reached an agreement. They reached an agreement of $15 million for this land, which is a reasonable amount of money. It's actually a pretty good deal. But at the last minute, the Colombian Senate rejected the proposal and demanded $10 million more. Well, that's still a reasonable amount of money for the land. But Theodore Roosevelt feels like he's been insulted. We had an agreement. We agreed that for $15 million, you would sell me this. Now you want $10 million more? That's just not good business. It's not the proper way to behave. So what are we going to do? Is Roosevelt going to take it laying down? Roosevelt doesn't take anything laying down. Roosevelt is very much a bull moose, bull in a china shop kind of guy. So what does he do? He enters into negotiations, believe it or not, with the volunteer fire department of Panama City. It's this major city in this Panamanian region. And he convinces the fire department that they should secede from Colombia and create their own country, the new nation of Panama. Now, I kid you not, what happened here in the Panamanian Revolution was the fire department of Panama City got one of their wives to sew a flag. They raised it over the fire department building, declared themselves to be the Independent Republic of Panama, and Theodore Roosevelt sent in the Navy to defend the new nation. The new nation of Panama very quickly negotiated with the United States and allowed them to build a canal. Did we, in fact, just steal the land? Well,
yes.
We paid for it, but yeah, we stole it. We instigated a revolution in Colombia, created the nation of Panama, and then negotiated with the nation we created to build this canal. I will say that the Panama Canal was the greatest technological accomplishment of the modern era. It took them from 1903 to 1913 to do this. It was done largely through executive orders of the president. Now, eventually, the Congress does accept it, but it took a while. In fact, Roosevelt later on in life, after he's out of the presidency, somebody asked him, how did he manage to get this done when nobody else could? And he famously said, I acted while Congress debated. What he means is, I just said do it. And I dared anybody to stop me. And he was so charismatic that he could do that. We were able to survive and do this with yellow fever because we had invented a new something new called DDT that was out there that was able to kill a lot of the mosquitoes, and that's why malaria, while it was still rampant, was not killing nearly as many people by this point. All right. So why is Theodore Roosevelt such a follower of gunboat diplomacy? Well, I think there's two reasons. There's preparedness and there's righteousness. And one of those probably makes a little more sense to us than the other. He said, he made the argument, and I think the argument can logically be made, whether you agree with it or not, the argument can be made at this time that only the United States was prepared enough to manage the world. And what he did is he looked around at the world and he said, you know what? We have a large population of people. That means we can field a large army if we need to. We have a strong industrial base. We have all the natural resources of coal and iron that's necessary to be an industrial powerhouse. And the last one is interesting. He said, and we have a strong Judeo-Christian morality. And he believed that those things combined to mean that the United States was in a unique place where they could manage the world, and if there was any problem in what he would have called third world nations, that it would be the responsibility of first world nations like the United States to go in and fix it. Okay? This is the beginning of American internationalism, which ever since Theodore Roosevelt has been our system. The United States is an internationalist system today. We stick our nose in everything, and it starts right here with Theodore Roosevelt. So I think preparedness is a logical argument, if not a good one. The next one is righteousness. He believed that the United States had a righteous duty to keep the less developed nations in order. Now, I'm using his terminology. It sounds very racist and Darwinistic to say less developed and more developed when you're talking about nations. But that's what the logic was at this time period. Social Darwinism was the rule of the day. And they believed that societies evolved. And the U.S. and England and France, they were highly evolved societies, while most of Latin America and Africa and Asia were not seen as evolved societies. As a result of this, he is going to interfere everywhere during his term. I love this quote, this is one of those quotes that I like so much that I should never be president, okay? It's Theodore Roosevelt. He said, war, like peace, is properly a means to an end. Righteousness. And what he means here is, if your goal is righteous, if your end goal is beneficial to society, then war is okay. And that was Theodore Roosevelt's mode of thinking. And I would argue that that has been the mode of thinking of the United States ever since then. If you're any kind of a modern student of history and all, you have to hear echoes of George W. Bush in all this stuff. It's a very, very Theodore Roosevelt style thought. You have to hear echoes of Theodore Roosevelt in Ronald Reagan. You have to hear echoes of Theodore Roosevelt later on in Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. We have done this over and over and over again. All right, so you can see the places we intervened. We intervened in Venezuela. There was a border dispute in Venezuela over a spot of land with where coal had been found. We intervened and we sided on England's side. In Panama in 1903, we initiated a revolution so we could have the canal. Panama still exists, by the way. We intervened to put down a civil war in Santo Domingo. In 1906, we go back into Cuba. We use the Platt Amendment to go back in and intervene in there. We are literally all over the place. And of course, we've already talked about mediating the Russo-Japanese War. Here's a map of it for you. This is just our interventions in Latin America during Roosevelt's term. All of those locations we were getting involved in, okay? We are the big dog on campus. We call this the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, okay? It is the belief that the United States is the police force for Latin America. And we told the world, look, not only, the Monroe Doctrine said you can't colonize Latin America. Now Roosevelt corollary says you can't do anything in Latin America. If you have a problem, you contact us, we'll take care of it. We're like the big brother here. If my little brother does something stupid, you come to me and I'll take care of it. Don't you do it, right? Well, that's kind of the way we were. All right, so let's move out of the war a little bit, and let's talk about Roosevelt as a progressive, because he really was the first progressive president. We have been in a progressive age pretty much since then. If I think of progressive presidents, I think of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, President Obama was a progressive president. John F. Kennedy was a progressive president. I think of those kind of guys. Well, he was the first of those guys. And what progressivism is, essentially, is it's a belief that government, that the state should be used to improve the lives of common people. That it's the role of the state to come in and help people. It's a different kind of view. Guys, up until this time period, the general belief of Americans was it was the role of the state to get the hell out of the way and let people do what they wanted to do. That's not the role anymore. Now the state is there to help people, to nanny them to an extent. And it fought against a lot of stuff. It fought against monopolies very heavy. If you don't know what a monopoly is, that's something that you absolutely have to know. And we've been over it in 3 or 4 lectures now, so you should know it by now. A monopoly is where one business controls an entire market and can set prices, okay? They fought against monopoly extremely hard. They broke up U.S. Steel. They broke up several railroad trusts. They broke up a lot of these things because they were monopolistic. They don't like that. They fought against government corruption and inefficiency. Government and corporate corruption and inefficiency. So they're looking to try and make things fair and efficient. And they also fought against social injustice. And I think this is where their argument is the strongest. They fought for things like rights for women, rights for African Americans. Later on, they're going to fight for rights for Mexican Americans and Chinese Americans. They're going to fight for child protection rights. They're going to fight for workers' rights. So they're going to do a lot of stuff that I think at least comes from a good place. Whether you think that's what they should have done or not, I think they were coming from a good place when they tried. Anytime we're in a progressive time period, there's two big characteristics. One, we're expansionist, and two, higher education enrollment always increases in those time periods. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. The expansion really makes sense. Because if you believe that the role of government is to help people that need help, how easy is it for you to say, well, people need help in other places a lot worse than they do here. So let's go interfere in Panama's election, you know, because they need our help. Or let's go to Iraq and overthrow a leader because they need our help. That's a progressive idea. The idea that higher education, I said high school education here because that was higher education at that time period. Most people didn't get past 8th grade. But college also goes up. And it kind of makes sense because the schools are going to be the tools of the progressive agenda. The progressives are going to use the schools to change the mind and to change the world. One of the first things they did was they rewrote the history books. Theodore Roosevelt was an early practitioner of that. We're going to write the history books to change people's minds. We still do that. They still do that. Y'all may have heard the term revisionist history. That's a big deal today, where people are changing. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It really isn't. Because sometimes our history books are bad, and we need to change them, okay? So sometimes revisionist history is okay. Sometimes it's not, all right? So you got to take things kind of with a grain of salt when you hear that. It's real easy to fall in the slump of, you know, revisionist history is always bad. Well, not if it was bad history to begin with, it's not. Here's some great examples of muckrakers of the time. They were progressives. A muckraker is an investigative journalist. Write that down somewhere. A muckraker is an investigative journalist. If you were thinking of what a muckraker is, today, a muckraker today would be a blogger, or it would be Snowden. Edward Snowden would be a muckraker today. The guy that you see on TV, the investigative reporter on the news that goes undercover to the restaurants to find out what their health inspections are like. That's a muckraker, okay? It's somebody that goes in and tries to find the slimy underside of society and bring it up for everybody to see. This is the golden age of the muckraker, okay? By the way, Theodore Roosevelt made that term up. And he was talking about it for the visual of it. Could you imagine like a big pot where you stick a rake in and you start moving around and all the stuff at the bottom comes up? That's the image he wants you to have of a muckraker. And you don't need to know all of these. I put a bunch up here. And I'm not going to go over all of them, but there's a few that you really need to know. I will tell you the ones you need to know as we go through, as I talk about them. So highlight them or asterisk or whatever you need to do. Make a note so you know which ones will be on the test. They're not all going to be there for sure. Henry DeMarcet Lloyd, you don't have to know him, but he wrote a book called Wealth Against Commonwealth, where he came in and he attacked Standard Oil for their unfair practices. What Standard Oil was doing, I think I gave you the example before, they would come into a town, they would open up a gas station and sell gas at a loss. And they would drive all the other gas stations out of business and then jack the price up and rip everybody off. It's called cutthroat competition. They attacked them for that. Thorsten Veblen, he attacks the Nuevo Riche, the newly rich, and he basically attacks them as these people that got rich on the backs of the workers, and the workers had no benefit of it. It was a very communistic book. The third one you need to know for sure, Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis you need. Jacob Riis was, he's an interesting character. He is the son of a wealthy family, but he wanted to know what it was like to be poor in New York. So he went undercover and he went to live in the slums of New York, and he spent several months living in the slums, living just like a new immigrant that was there. But he chronicled the whole thing with pictures. A book called How the Other Half Lives. You ever get to see the pictures on it? They are phenomenal. It really shows you what society was like. Lincoln Steffens, he's not super important. He's the guy that goes on and attacks the deals that were made between railroad companies and the Senate. I'm going to skip David Phillips. Ray Stannard Baker, I want you to know him. He's kind of important. Ray Stannard Baker went into particularly Southern schools, black schools in the South. And his book called Following the Color Line, where he looked at literacy rates in black schools, compared them to literacy rates in white schools, and then looked at the amount of money spent per student. And he proved that the reason why black students were scoring worse than white students was directly correlated to the amount of money spent on them. We weren't spending nearly as much money to educate our black students as we were our white students. I'm going to go all the way down to Jack London, just because y'all might know Jack London. Y'all ever had to read The Call of the Wild at school or something? It's a classic book. But before Jack London was famous for The Call of the Wild, he wrote this book called The War of the Class, which I find fascinating because people forget about it and how right Jack London was. We're talking about 1900, and Jack London writes, warning that there's going to be a social revolution. And he says, the workers of the world will not continue to be taken advantage of by management. And he warns that the workers are going to unite, and they're going to overthrow the owners and take over the businesses. He was absolutely right, just not in the wrong place. He thought it was going to happen everywhere, and he used the U.S. as his model. It didn't happen in the U.S., but it happened in most of the rest of Europe. It happened in Germany, it happened in France, it happened to an extent in England. Russia, it happened big time. That's called the Communist Revolution. He predicted the Communist Revolution when nobody had any idea that was coming. The last one is the most important one. You must know this one. Upton Sinclair ends up on the STAR test every year. He'll be there somewhere. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle. I would suggest you read it. I used to require my students to read it. I don't anymore because, again, it got kind of expensive to buy. And I just got tired of telling y'all to go buy so many books, so we'll just talk about it a little bit. The Jungle is a book about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. But it's written as a novel. And it shows this image that you open it up to is of a guy working in the meatpacking industry. And as the meat is moving down to be processed, there's rats running across the meat, and there's rat poison. And as it's going to be ground, these rats and this poisonous meat all get ground together, and then it gets served up to Americans. It's a pretty disturbing picture to go.
It got some attention.
It got a lot of attention. It got so much attention that Theodore Roosevelt read it and pushed through the Pure Food and Drug Act after that. We have the Pure Food and Drug Act today because this book came out. Now here's the other side of the story. We find out years later that Upton Sinclair was also a bit of a liar. He was not a good person. He greatly exaggerated stuff. He wrote another book later on about Sacco and Vanzetti, where he ignored information that proved that Sacco and Vanzetti had confessed to their crimes and wrote about them as heroes. He was just not a good person. He was a great writer and a super important muckraker, though. All right, let's talk about political progressivism and some changes that happened because of this time period. And if you're a political junkie like me, this is the part where your ears are going to perk up a little bit, because this is how you can screw with the government if you know how to do this stuff, okay? three things happened. We developed what we call the initiative, the referendum, and the recall at this time. And this is because in the progressive period, we believed that power should be held closer by the people. So we started looking for ways for the people to check the power of the state a little more. And some states have these, some states don't. Texas has some and doesn't have some. We'll talk about them as we go. They actually got their start in Wisconsin. But the first is called the initiative. The initiative allows voters to directly propose legislation. This is the way it works. Let's say there's a law that you think is popular, and you want to be you want your legislators to vote on it. A new state law. You want to raise the speed limit to 85 miles an hour, but nobody has the nerve to initiate to put it before the House. In Texas, we have initiative. Most states do. If you can get enough signatures, and it changes from state to state, I think it's 10% of the number of people that voted in the last governor's election, which you have to have in Texas. But if you can get enough signatures, then you can force an initiative vote, and they'll put it on the ballot, and if enough people vote for it, you can send it to Congress. You can send it up there, and you've initiated a law. It's a pretty cool way to do things, okay? I will tell you that surprisingly, our state legislatures love initiative because it gives them political cover. They can sit back and go, I didn't do that. The people did it. It gives them a little political cover. So initiatives. Now, we overuse it in Texas dramatically. There's 500 initiatives on the ballot every time you go vote. But it is a cool way to do things. Well, let's say there's another law. Instead of just proposing it, let's say there's a law that's, popular with the people, but not so popular that it's an easy victory. Let's say your legislature doesn't want to vote on this issue. What they can do is they can put it on the ballot as a referendum vote. We have this in Texas too, where you go up and you vote on a referendum. This is where, instead of the legislature voting, they just put it out on the general ballot, and the people get to vote whether or not something becomes a new law or not. And if 50% plus one approve it, it becomes a new law. You just bypass the legislature. Brexit was an example of that, yeah. And we have a lot of referendums. Usually they're local referendums. Usually it's like school district referendums, stuff like that. But we have a lot of referendums, and that's something we have in Texas. Again, believe it or not, the legislature likes this, because if it's a controversial vote, they can put it out to the people, and they can again say, well, I didn't vote for that. But if it passes, they can say, I supported that. It gives them political cover. And the last one is recall. We don't have recall in Texas. Not many states do. California does, Wisconsin, a few do. I'm not a fan of recall, but it's out there. It's part of the Wisconsin idea. And this allows the citizens, by a popular vote, to remove a poorly performing official before their term of office is over. It's a way of getting them out of office without impeaching them. You're not saying they committed a crime. They don't really have to do anything illegal. All they have to do is do something that the voters disapprove of. If the voters disapprove of something, they can remove them. We've done this a few times. Several years ago, the governor of California, a guy named Gray Davis, was recalled, and that's how Arnold Schwarzenegger became the governor of California. He was the governor for a few years. A couple of years ago, they tried to recall Scott Walker in Wisconsin. He beat it. But a recall is this one scares me, because it's too easy to just, for this to just be a political decision. I think it should be hard to remove somebody if they're elected. But it's one of those progressive ideas. The last one is one that is super important and the one that I think is essential, and that's the secret ballot. Something we take advantage or just take for granted today is that when you go vote, your vote is your business. Okay? Well, it wasn't always that way. Before the secret ballot was put in place, most votes, you would show up on election day at the voting box, and the election judge would stand up and go, raise your hand if you're for Bob, and they would, and they'd write you down. Raise your hand if you're for Bill, and you'd raise your hand, and they'd write it down. Now, it was fast, it was easy, but there was a big problem with it. What happens if your boss is there watching you and going, you better be voting for who I want you to, or you're not going to have a job? It led itself to intimidation very easily. So, the secret ballot's important. Now, I would say that we've gone too far with it. I don't know if y'all are aware of this or not, but it is illegal in the state of Texas for you to take a picture of your ballot and post it. The secret ballot is so ingrained that if you take a picture with your phone of your ballot and post it, you can legally be put in jail for it. I haven't seen any cases of that, and they hadn't come and got me yet, because I usually do that just to prove a point. But but you can be. Then we have the 17th Amendment. And to me, this is absolutely the worst amendment we ever passed. Now, that's my opinion, and I try and be fair with you. A lot of people love the 17th Amendment. I would get rid of it tomorrow if I could. The 17th Amendment called for the direct election of U.S. senators. We didn't used to get to vote for our senators directly. What we did is we elected our state legislatures and we elected our House of Representatives, but the senators were selected by the state legislature. And the reason they did that was because the House was supposed to be the voice of the people, and the Senate was supposed to be the voice of the state. And there would be a balance there. Well, during this time period, during President Wilson, who's the next guy we're going to deal with, this is going to change, and the 17th Amendment is going to pass, which is going to, well, it's going to change that. It's going to create two houses of representatives, basically. Again, most people like it. I do not. I think we've lost the vote of the state now. The states have no voice anymore. During this progressive period, women continued to fight for the vote. They made some progress. They did not get it yet. They're going to get it at the end of this period. But they're trying. People like this lady here, Carrie Lane Chapman Catt. She was the president of NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She was a big fighter for equality for women. By 1915, women were able to vote in some elections in 2/3 of the states. They still couldn't vote for president unless they were Susan B. Anthony, and she just went and did it anyway, and nobody argued with her because she scared them. I kid you not, Susan B. Anthony, for 20 years, she would just show up at the election box in New York City and tell the person she was going to vote. And when they argued with her, she'd stare them down until they gave her a ballot. And she voted illegally, huh?
Was she manly looking?
She was just mean. She was brutally tough. I kind of like her. But they are getting to vote in some elections. They're getting to vote for mayor. They're getting to vote for governor in some places. All right. I want to talk a little bit more about progressivism in politics with the Wisconsin idea. That's this guy, Robert La Follette, that came up. Robert La Follette always looks creepy to me. He looks like a magician or something. I don't know. Robert La Follette was a congressman from Wisconsin, and his fear was that there was too much money in politics. We've all heard that, right? There's too much money in politics. We've got to get the money out. Well, he tried. And he tried by doing a couple things. The first thing, I love the first one. He called for the direct primary. If you don't know what a primary is, a primary election, that's what's going on right now. If you haven't gone, if you're of voting age, go vote. Early voting is on now. Go vote if you know what you're voting for. Don't go vote if you have no idea. Uninformed voters drive me crazy. Yeah, waiting till election day is probably better. The only problem with that is if you get in a wreck or something comes up. Or if you're like me, just show up at the Libertarian Convention and vote there. So, Robert La Follette comes up with this idea of the direct primary, where we got to elect our candidates. That's not how it used to be done. It used to be done, we call the smoke-filled room. The candidates were put up by political bosses, and we didn't get a voice as the people until election day. And we had to choose from whoever the party bosses chose to put up. Well, the direct primary changes that. We can, we can choose who runs. That's a good thing. The next thing he does is he calls for campaign spending limits. The reason he wanted to do this is because he wanted to level the field so the rich couldn't buy their way into an election. Sounds great. Believe me, I don't want the rich buying their way into an election. I've been the victim of that before. So I understand. I have an issue with this. I think it's a violation of free speech. I think spending your money is a free speech issue. There's got to be a better way to do it than that. And the last one is he wanted to restrict lobbyists. If you don't know what a lobbyist is, their job is to inform, educate, and change the minds of legislators. And for a lot of them, there's a special place in hell. I've got a really good friend of mine that is a lobbyist, and I tell him that to his face on a regular basis. They do serve a purpose. Sometimes they're the only experts on something, and you do need them. But a lot of times, they are buying legislators. By the way, they're called lobbyists because during the Grant administration, it was rumored at least that they would hang around the lobby of the hotel across from the White House where Grant would go to the bar to drink. And they would wait till Grant had too much to drink and then go and try and convince him to pass laws they wanted. So they called them lobbyists because that's where they hovered. In the cities, we have a lot of progressivism happening as well. A lot of new ideas. The idea of a city manager. I like the idea of a city manager. A city manager is somebody that's gone to school and been educated on how to run a city. And they are not elected to the office. So they don't have to campaign or make any promises to people when they come in. Now, they are hired by those people who are elected. But the thought was this would take the politics out of this and let them make tough decisions. Most of our cities today have a city manager that runs things. The mayor does not usually run a city anymore. By the way, if you want to write your own ticket on how to make money, right now, city manager is one of the fastest growing fields in education. And there is a massive shortage of people that are qualified to do this for up and coming cities. I have a former student that is a city manager in Athens now, and makes pretty good money at it. So it's something if you're into politics and want to do something interesting, I think it'd be an interesting thing to do with your life. In another life, I might have gotten into that. We also came up with the idea of municipal socialism. Municipal socialism is the belief that your public utilities, particularly your transportation, your gas, your electricity, and your water, should be owned by the city and not by private individuals. And prices should be kept low because there's no need to make a profit if you're, if it's owned by the city. They fought to end prostitution. Prostitution was a massive problem in our cities, and they try and stop that at this time. They try and slow down juvenile delinquency. One of the programs that came up during the Roosevelt administration. Anybody seen the movie The Rescuers? Mm-hmm. When you were a kid? The movie The Rescuers is based on something that really happened. Not about the mice and all, but about a kid that gets in trouble and gets sent off to live in the country. Well, that was one of the ways they dealt with with juvenile delinquency was they would take kids from the cities and they'd send them out to the country to do a hard day's work during the summertime. And you go live with another family and try and teach you morals and values. That was one of the goals that was on there. They started prosecuting slumlords for not maintaining their buildings, solving the epidemic problem. They started putting in child labor laws for the first time in history. Now, there weren't a lot of them. Your children could still work, but they couldn't work in the factories, climbing around in the machines, or working in coal mines anymore. Some states put a minimum wage law in place. That drives me crazy. I hate the minimum wage. We should get rid of it. But there were states that thought that that was a good idea back then, and eventually that's going to be overridden by the Constitution, by the Supreme Court. Hiram Johnson, the governor of California, he breaks up railroad trust. That's a big deal. Charles Evans Hughes, who you might not know, but if you want to know what he looks like, he was the model for the guy on the Monopoly board with the monocle. Charles Evans Hughes was the governor of New York, and he broke up insurance companies for fraud at this time period. So there's a lot of good things happening in the city. All right, we're going to stop there, and we will finish this lecture on Wednesday. And then we have one more big lecture.